Well, hello there. Today's guest is James Stevens, who is the CEO and founder of Iron Light LLC. Hello, James. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm a pleasure to speak with you this morning.
Thank you. So, it looks like you have a lot of very interesting experiences. I've listened to you on several different panels, and it looks like you're in the cannabis space, you're also in the psychedelic space. So, can you tell us a little bit about what Iron Light works with and your journey into really the formation of that company?
Yeah, so really what Ironlight does and what we're doing is kind of myself and my partner Taylor Woods is we're kind of providing a base that kind of gives, someone looking at starting a brand or trying to grow a brand or grow their product or their process or whatever, kind of giving them the support on things they don't necessarily need that we didn't have as entrepreneurs. So both of us had started multiple companies. I ran a product development and design firm that did natural and sustainable products for 13 years before I got an exit last year. So I got the coveted exit in the cannabinoid space, right? So we've gotten into hemp and we're doing a lot of work with, minor cannabinoids and, cannabidiol, and that attracted the attention of a large kind of hemp company that just recently had gotten a large amount of funding. So that kind of led to that exit. But really what we realized is there's this gap in kind of there's some articles out there, but there's gap in especially among founders and people trying to start their companies and thinking about everything wrong. And what we realized early on, and we found some articles that kind of supported the thesis, is really this idea that you need to form right from the get-go a minimum viable company and not a minimum viable product.
Hmm.
And so, not only do you need to have a product, you need to know how you're going to get the attention towards your product out there, and then you also need to know who's going to buy your product. And then that falls into everything else, which is highly complicated, right? How to form your company, how to do the supply chain. Does anybody actually really want your product, right? I mean, I think the biggest killer, even though there's debate on it is really a lack of product market fit out there, especially as things are getting crowded. And so the cannabis space now is incredibly crowded, right? So if you don't have a product fit to a niche market, right, that you're going to target, right? Like everyone's talking about going after the silver sneakers, right? People over, let's say, 60 who might really benefit from, whether that's hemp-derived cannabinoids or, drug type cannabinoids from there. They're doing that, but they don't understand any of the market segmentation there. And so really one of the things that we've done early on is we come in and talk about building everything with intent. You need to start out from the intent. What's your business going to be? Where you want to end up? Do you want an exit or is this a lifestyle brand? All of those kind of things. And we bring that kind of into the whole thought process when we work with various firms. And some people, engage with us just to help develop a small part of a technical process, right? Like how to crystallize or purify a specific component or combine a cannabinoid with another botanical active as an example. Or we have people that are coming in and they're like, I just want to get in this space. What should we do? And we start with everything from the ideation session, okay, what's your product? What's your market demographic? What are you passionate about? What's your intent in building this company? All the way through, developing the product, engaging in R&D, figuring out the supply chains, helping with branding, website build out, scale up, all that kind of stuff, whether we do it internally or we bring a network of people we know around the world together to help with that. It's kind of this range. It's kind of this almost I guess, lack of a better term, almost like co-founders for hire. We're not really your co-founder, but we have so much experience, and because we've done this entrepreneurship, we can fill a lot of those gaps.
Fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about your first cannabis venture? What was your entry into this market?
You know, Interestingly enough, my first venture entry into this market was really weirdly enough from the other side of the coin. I did a lot of diagnostic development in this space to not only do drug testing, you think of rapid blood tests or
Mhm.
rapid urinalysis tests or drug testing, but also doing things like integrating gas chromatography to look for things like terpenes that could be done mounted to drones and stuff like that. So a drone could fly around and look for where illicit grows were being grown. So really, I came at it almost from the quote unquote enemy side originally, and that was my initial exposure in the 2000s to cannabis and the constituents and the metabolic constituents and drug testing and all of that. And then I got really heavily into developing natural products at the end of the 2000s. Really got really passionate about botanical medicine, botanical science, like extracts, fermentation, developing natural products. And then, lo and behold, kind of, circa 2018, in Montana's hemp pilot program got involved into the hemp industry. And with that, some of the farmers we knew kind of got hosed by some scammers in the thing, and they'd grown huge amounts of hemp and had no idea what to do with it. And so we kind of ended up almost accidentally in this space because we were doing extensive mass scale extractions naturally with CO2, with solvents, with whatever, of things like vanilla and mint and like spices. And we were doing all this stuff for the flavor and fragrance industry, and we were doing chemical conversions of those and changing all that kind of stuff. So we had this knowledge base, and that kind of jumped us right into paying attention in the cannabis space. And so kind of regionally from here, like the Montana region, that was an engagement with farmers on the hemp space. And then nationwide and worldwide, kind of at a similar time and some a little bit earlier, we started paying attention to what was going on, in the kind of drug type cannabis space. And really where technology could be deployed, what technology could go in there. Obviously, everyone was kind of gun shy around it. So a lot of our kind of service or whatever in this space was a lot more like discussion, like what's the cutting edge technology you could deploy from flavor and fragrance and really accelerate cannabis. So like in that case, circa 2018, 2019, we were doing a lot of effectively, lack of a better term, consulting like in California on like, how do you make things more soluble? What are novel delivery mechanisms? We started cooking up like crazy ideas, right? So we were talking about, could we work with a vineyard who wanted to make like a drinkable cannabis wine? And like, the problem is the slow onset of, THC when it's consumed. How do you speed that up? So we looked at like crazy ideas, like taking the stinging cells from anemones and like actually filling those stinging cells, taking the neurotoxin out of it and actually putting THC in it because it's pretty much painless if you use the right strain, where like if you drank the wine, it would literally sting your tongue and inject that material directly into your bloodstream. Not that ever got commercialized, but we were just looking at crazy, like kooky ideas like that. And so, that's kind of where I got really passionate about, all right, this is functional medicine. And then to be honest, I really wasn't a true believer other than maybe people were using THC to mitigate, bad moods or pain. I didn't think, the cannabis hemp space had a lot until I really started seeing the effects of a lot of these compounds, especially like CBD compounds with high minors, really impacting people with PTSD. And so my dad's a veteran, he did counseling for veterans for a long, long time, for probably 30 years when I'm doing the math in my head. A lot of people with heavy PTSD. So I was really kind of passionate about how this plant medicine, it doesn't even have to be cannabis, but, cannabinoids seem to be a quick win in this space of like, how do you treat PTSD and how do you treat depression and really go forward from there. And I'm really excited to see a lot of, potential clinical trials come up and really see this validation that these botanical solutions could really, cause people who've experienced trauma, great relief. And honestly, COVID's changed our entire world, right? So what used to kind of be, people who underwent, sexual assault or violent crime or were involved in wartime scenarios had extreme PTSD. Now I think you're seeing a large amount of the U.S. population and maybe even the world population, presenting symptoms of PTSD because of being locked in, because of chronic fear, about, getting sick, all this kind of stuff. Chronic fear leads to kind of these stress responses, right, if you're always on. And so really kind of seeing where cannabinoids can improve your mental state, and do that. And after doing a lot of study, I do really believe to get the true effects, you almost need a full experience from the plant. So there has to be, THC as a component of the cannabinoid experience to really get the effects that you want to see versus like isolates. It kind of opens this door to this material really being able to improve people's quality of life. And in 2016, I would have just laughed and said, yeah, people just want to get high to relieve their pain. And now I firmly believe you could use this material, you could use cannabis and cannabinoids and all this in a way, not only to treat and alleviate symptoms, but really kind of improve your entire kind of holistic well-being, right? The science for me is still out on whether people have cannabinoid deficiency or like that. I'm still too much of a scientist just to buy that straight out of the gate. But I do think I've seen more than enough anecdotal information to see that this material is a huge component, like in mental wellness, in productivity, all the kind of stuff that, you and I have been talking about.
Fantastic. Well, you did cover a whole lot of ground, so I'm going to backtrack
Yeah,
a
I
little
talked
bit
really fast.
and
Apologies.
no, absolutely, it's fascinating. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit and really kind of dig a little deeper into some of the concepts that you raised. So when you talked about the sea anemones, were you able to actually produce that technology?
Yeah, we were able to do a demonstration where we could load, various, whether it was, equivalent to cannabinoids or CBD or whatever, into isolated nematocystis stinging cells and get that to where it was delivered. No one wanted to suck in a mouthful of,
Sure.
anemone cells. So, actual real trials never got past that, but we were able to demonstrate that that material could be loaded into those cells and it was viable. So. Maybe not
Interesting.
cost effective, but the tech was viable. So,
So
and it was
what?
really fun because I'm a big believer in biomimicry, and so here we're taking something from nature, a delivery mechanism, in this case for a toxin, but it could also bypass a lot of the concerns. And like my big thing is because of the vape crisis, I was very interested in trying to find alternative delivery mechanisms that were quick onset delivery without people having to inhale material into their lungs.
So that it was an innovative delivery option.
Yeah, and that's really what it was about. Is like people were talking about water soluble and mixing stuff with emulsifiers and detergents and encapsulation, and we're like, can we figure out a different way to do this?
Interesting. Now, you mentioned biomimicry. Is this the only instance where you've used biomimicry, or is that something that you actually have been able to commercialize in other projects?
Yeah, so the beauty of living in Missoula, Montana, is this is where Janine Bayous and Biomimicry 3.8 is based out of, and I've
Interesting.
interacted with them many times. I'm friends with a lot of people there, So like I try to incorporate biomimicry into almost everything that I do first, whether that was food projects and we were looking at mimicking ecosystems, whether that was color delivered from different things. Biomimicry is the first thing I kind of turn to when I'm looking for a creative solution because, honestly, nature has 3.8 billion years of R&D that,
Hmm.
working with guys like at Biomimicry 3.8 and the Biomimicry Institute, we can kind of shortcut, right? A lot of the things that we want to do, nature's figured out how to do it. We just need to figure out how to make that scalable.
Interesting. So, have you utilized biomimicry to make a project scalable?
Yeah, so I've used biomimicry in kind of dozens of scenarios where we looked at it, everything from a physical structure to make something stronger or more supportive to how nature, uses certain types of waxes to prevent water from getting into a product. So I've used it for packaging. I've used it for the actual production of chemicals. I've used biomimicry techniques for like membrane filtration to actually purify compounds, primarily in the food industry. So there's so much that we've actually deployed biomimicry in, or at least the fundamental concept of biomimicry. If it's not a direct nature, it's not like a material from an organism in nature, but like we've mimicked like the chemical or physical structure to do something. So like being able to deploy that, I think it's really nature's genius, and that's what you see Biomimicry 3.8 say constantly, is really just like this solid kind of base to work on stuff. And I always joke when I talk about it, it is kind of like giving the secret sauce, because there's so much, inspiration from what our natural systems are already doing. But on the flip side, I'd like to see everybody in the world use biomimicry as their base because it's usually inherently more sustainable.
My apologies. This particular portion we're going to have to cut out because we've had a lot of back conversations. I don't know if you can
Uh,
hear everything in the background.
it sounds like there's a door, like you're in an
Yeah.
airport.
We'll
So
have to. So this is minute 22, so we'll have to cut this little piece out. Okay.
that's
All
no problem.
right. So can you take us through an example of, like a specific example of when you've used biomimicry, like a case study?
Yeah, so I think a really good case study of where we've used biomimicry to do, outside of trying to use the stinging cells from an anemone, right, is one of the things that biomimicry does really well is nature is super efficient. And so we really used biomimicry heavily in a fermentation technique that we developed where we effectively copied the ecosystem of how organisms interact in a swamp to
Mhm.
make sure that we could bring feedstocks in and degrade those feedstocks down. So this would be a great example is if you could select a system where you could throw, cannabis flower into it and you selected an ecosystem that broke down everything but the cannabinoids and you are allowed to accumulate effectively the equivalent of like crude oil or sludge in this process and break down all the stuff that you don't want except the cannabinoids and maybe the terpenes, and then harvest that oil out of it. That's a great example. We did it with flavoring compounds. We did a lot of work where we had the microorganisms break down, just like a swamp, you have stuff grow, the plant matter dies, the microorganisms break it down,
Mhm.
and then they pull it apart into base constituents, and then they start sticking it back together in other things. So, like a lot of people don't know, a lot of like effectively what we consider fossil resources are a byproduct of not only like geology. I used to always think it was squished dinosaurs, right? That's what everyone always told you oil was. But in reality, it's generally algae dies, it gets goes into sedimentation, microbes get in there, the microbes start breaking that down, they switch it from, cellulose and things like that into oils and go forward from there. And I think that was kind of our big crowning project was effectively using biomimicry to mimic kind of a full ecological process to turn pretty much any biomass into this whole wider range of flavoring compounds. We made everything from vegan bacon flavor, so we used to always call it halacin, right? Halal approved bacon flavor, which we always thought was pretty funny. Probably not PC in today's world, but so be it. To juicy fruit type flavors and mouthfeel compounds that make you taste like umami and like all this fun stuff. And so we got really good at turning random crazy feedstocks into all these different kind of compounds. And then that technology and those conversion ideas and purification techniques ported themselves super easily over into cannabinoids, right? Because we just kind of looked at everything differently. We looked at how to make stuff water dispersible differently than everybody else, or how to do purification, or, I think the big one that everyone laughs about is, we were able to economically, extract hemp that was like 0.2% cannabinoids and
Mhm.
economically get out, the cannabinoids from stuff that everyone else in the industry is like, well, you can't even make money if you do that. And it was just this kind of different way of looking at things and a different way of looking at scale.
Interesting. So you mentioned flavor, and I remember there was a very specific time in the cannabis space where edibles went from tasting absolutely awful to tasting amazing. Were you involved in the formation of that technology, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we did a lot of work kind of in that shift and kind of basis, and a lot of that was less about developing new technology and actually convincing people in the cannabis space and convincing people in the flavoring and fragrance industry to almost like interface or work with each other, right? So kind
Hmm.
of we used to always joke we could take like what we considered 1950s flavoring technology and put it in the cannabis space and look like geniuses, right? Because stuff did taste terrible.
Hmm.
Like, tinctures were made in people's basements and
Yes.
people barely had a concept, of flavor and profile. The best you could maybe get is someone mixed a bunch of terpenes together and made it taste like a lemon instead of, tasting like typical, drug type cannabis. And so with
Bong
that,
water
there's been a
sometimes.
huge, some terrible stuff out there, right? And then all of a sudden, people realized, that they could, a lot of companies kind of, especially on the flavoring side, probably circa 2018, really even before the Farm Bill kind of went through, all of a sudden was like, oh, there's a huge market here. This stuff tastes bad. And so what you saw is you saw the smaller flavoring companies really start getting in and delivering some of their technology, which I would consider old, like almost like 1950s, 60s, 70s technology. And now you're seeing the hotshot firms with like amazing bitter blockers and encapsulation technology and all of that stuff really get in. And honestly, there's probably a list of, 6 or 7 flavoring houses, but there's 2 of them that I know that are like top-notch technology on bitter blocking, solubility, palatability, that they're deploying their technology into the space. And, we're working with them to deploy the technology in the space that you're just seeing like almost revolutionary changes in cannabinoid products, right? Especially, I think you're going to see some amazing stuff come out on the beverage front, over the next, like, let's say 12 to 24 months. because they are able to use preservation techniques and stuff that comes out of flavor to protect the cannabinoids from like the liners of cans, right? I can't remember if it was Canopy or who it was in Canada, that they kind of had to roll back their beverage process
Right.
because the
I think
liners
it
in the
was
cans were
Constellation, yeah.
actually like sucking the that was actually sucking the THC out of the
Right.
product. And so by using, standard flavoring techniques and technologies that are kind of well known in, everyday products that you buy, all of a sudden now we can protect the cannabinoids from, being sucked out into the can, and we can extend their life, and we can keep them from settling and making an oily layer and all that kind of stuff. And so I really think, that shift of focus from, oh, this has this much THC in it, or this is a 3,000 milligram tincture or whatever, right? I think you're going to see a focus away from potency and towards a pleasant experience. And that's what I would encourage anyone in the space working on is, really go out and see what your consumer would want to do. How do they want to consume, right? Like, do they want to relax in a social environment? Obviously, COVID is making that kind of crazy. But if you look, people are breaking quarantines and all sorts of stuff to go socialize now because they're fed up with being away from humans. We're pack animals. At the end of the day, humans want to socialize. Now, they want to socialize in very specific ways, and it's different than what people think. But at the end of the day, we don't want to be apart. And so, like, if you can build products that are encouraged and are around socialization, people drink alcohol to unwind, right? Good, bad, or indifferent. Alcohol does kind of, at least temporarily, seem to kind of like make you forget your stresses of the day and loosen your muscles. So products that are really kind of set in that unwinding, anti-anxiety, kind of end your day kind of thing that can be done in a social format, I think that's where you're going to see a huge surge in popular products.
No, that's really interesting. I was recently on a panel where they were discussing edible technology, and one of the issues that a lot of people really fear with edibles is that typically it takes a very long time for you to feel the effects, and by the time that you feel the effects, you may have already dosed yourself twice or three times. So that lag is really creating a major problem for edible companies because people really are afraid of taking any edibles. And they were talking about how they're developing a technology to basically bridge that gap and enable the person to experience the effects, within 20 minutes so they can actually gauge their dosing.
Well, and I think that'll be the key is like, if you drink, I guess, of my old days, I had a way higher tolerance. But if you drink a glass of wine or a beer or whatever or a cocktail with friends, you generally feel it within like 15 or 20 minutes, right? You're going to feel something, pretty quick. And I think for cannabis, to really maintain a status outside of smoking as a social use material, it's going to have to break that gap and get it to where you can feel that effect. I think the other thing that the industry kind of poses is like, there's a huge difference in tolerance between a routine user and someone who is just casually using it for social reasons, right, to unwind or whatever. And, and that dosing is so variable. Like, 5 milligrams might lay me out and you might need 50, right? Even if you're not a routine user to like have the same effect. And so figuring out how to play around with those dosing and get that right, that's going to be a big challenge too, to kind of almost like standardize the effect, right? We know that one drink usually gets processed in 1 hour by your liver, and, the general adult male who doesn't routinely drink can drink, 2 or 3 beers before they feel an obvious buzz. Like there's things we just know with alcohol that are fairly standard, 80-90% of the population, that we just don't know with cannabinoids. And it's a problem with all acinogenic materials, right? So all these materials, whether it's cannabis or you go into psilocybin or you go into other psychedelics or you even go into like, other party drugs, for the most part, they don't necessarily respond the same way for everybody, right? And so that is a unique challenge on making cannabis a consistent consumer good that I think is really something that needs to be tackled by both science and the industry, right? We need large trials to see, how does this material affect a large swath of the population, right? I'd love to see a standardized dosing with a quick onset mechanism, go through a 10,000 person trial and see how they all experience it, right? Because that data would be priceless to the industry. Now, it costs a lot and take a lot of work to do it, but
Right.
nonetheless, that data would go a long way. And that is what like traditional food companies do with a lot of their products they roll out, or even some of the bigger dietary supplement companies, or even cosmetics, right? They do large trials on new ingredients or anti-aging materials or like a new thing to make you like want Doritos more or whatever. It really doesn't
Right.
matter. They do huge trials on this. And, cannabis is definitely, and hemp too, definitely a little more Wild West. It's like, oh, let's mix this, 35 milligram THCV chewing gum together and see what actually happens. What happened
Mhm.
for me is it gave me a migraine,
Right.
right? For me, it was not a pleasant experience, and it was kind of this random like process.
Hmm.
And so for that, I think, a lot more of that research or whatever, I think would do the industry well. But it's going to require a lot more collaboration. I see a lot more kind of competition in
Right.
the industry because everyone's worried about taking their little slice of bread. I think if they understood how much large companies collaborate, even if they're competitors,
Hmm.
at least on certain fundamental technologies or whatever, I think the industry would be highly surprised. I was surprised when I learned how much like major CPG companies and stuff kind of collaborate where they can, but not like break, antitrust laws and stuff like that.
Oh, interesting. Can you give us an example of a CPG company that collaborates with others?
There's a whole bunch of them that collaborate with a nonprofit called the Manel Sensory Sciences Center. So I think
Mm.
it's MENELL. Chemical Senses Center. So it's a research institute in Philadelphia, and that's how they channel a lot of this, right? A
Hmm.
bunch of them will fund, these kind of nonprofits or whatever, and then they get to participate like in the information or research that comes out of it, right? So Manel's, a very interesting one because they do things with like they do achievements like finding the first sweet tasting proteins,
Hmm.
and they did research that signalized that body odors can be signals for disease before any other symptoms appear,
Right.
right? And then they know different people like different tastes at different times. And so this is all their research. Well, a lot of it is very kind of cool and, might be science or health related. It's really all funded because everyone's trying to make their product taste better
Sure.
or smell better or last longer or give people some kind of experience, right? So there's a huge amount of stuff that is really kind of interested from there because, these kind of groups or these nonprofits or these think tanks can get a bunch of resources and funding. And like, I know a bunch of the major CPG companies have all put funding at one point or another to access Manel Sensory Sciences stuff.
Interesting. It's funny, I read somewhere that cheese puffs is the most well studied food product because it is so critical to have the perfect pop of cheese and salt at
Yep.
the same time. So I found that really fascinating because it seems like such a simple snack food, right? But there's a lot of
Well,
science that
I
probably
always
goes
joke
behind it.
about I always joke about that with vegan cheese and why it tastes so bad is people don't realize that cheese is an incredibly complicated product. That requires like fermentation and flavor and mouthfeel and all this stuff's going on with cheese. So when you try to take like almond spread and make it taste like cheese, it doesn't just work if you just put cheese flavor in it. Right? There's so much other stuff that you experience. And so there's all this knowledge out there that can really assess and help the cannabis industry. Like, I mean, the technology out there to do everything from water solubility to tasting good to quick onset to all that kind of stuff, it exists in one form or another in this space already. And that technology just needs to be found. And then whoever owns the technology just has to be willing to put it into the space. Now, I mean, there's some people who won't do it for either legal fear reasons, right? Like the UN Convention on Narcotics or the fact that it's federally illegal, or they won't do it for ethical reasons, right? There's lots of companies that have amazing technology, but they just, from an ethics perspective, they're not going to do anything that'll support the cannabis space.
Right. Now, is there any post consumer data collection? I know there's a lot of pre sale data collection that goes really, from seed to the sale. But I always wondered if post sale, if any of that data is collected or looked at.
So, and I'm part of I helped found a company called Aurelius Data, and
Hmm.
so Julie Armstrong's the CEO of that, and its whole function really is to start collecting that post sale data specifically on an analysis of the chemical breakdown of the product, like, all right, can we get their QC data, or do we analyze the data or whatever, combined with the consumer, lack of a better term, the consumer sentiment or consumer experience data. And what we really want to do is we want to be able to create databases where if people use a specific product, be it, a CBD tincture, or they're consuming a specific strain of cannabis and they smoke it, and they're using it to alleviate these symptoms, we want to look at the metadata, like the huge cloud of data, and start correlating and figuring out where all these products can help people for certain conditions, right? Whether that be a mental health condition or that be a physical ailment, not only in, cannabis, but it's effectively all kind of botanical medicine, right? Whether that's, essential oils and aromatherapy, whether that's psychedelics and psilocybin, it really doesn't matter. The whole goal of the organization is to start looking for what really works for people, right? Because, the pharmaceutical companies have massive clinical trials they do on stuff, but, everyone kind of poo-poos and looks down on plant medicine and homeotherapy, homeopathy and all that stuff. And what we really want to do is we really want to gather enough of that data from people who are using it to where the anecdotal data goes away, and we can start identifying some real points where these complex mixtures, cannabis is a super complex mixture. Any essential oil is, food is medicine, nutraceutical stuff. That's all super complex. We want to start trying to correlate that with mass, metadata, and machine learning kind of a logarithm analysis of this to really figure out what's working. And that's really a passion of mine, is like, look, there's indigenous knowledge back, 10, 20,000 years on a lot of this stuff working and helping people, right? They didn't have pharmaceuticals, but people could still find a root and chew on it. And all of a sudden, like, maybe their infection went away, or like their fever went down or whatever. And so with that, I want to be able to start really figuring out a mechanism to prove that a lot of these natural and indigenous solutions work, or prove that they don't work, right? If it is just totally doesn't work at all, I'd really like that stuff to stop being sold as something that can work as well. It's really hard to prove a negative, though. So, if someone has a headache and they eat something and the headache goes away, and they eat that same thing 20 times and their headache goes away each time, or, they have joint pain and they smoke it, their joint pain goes away every single time, really easy to prove that. If it doesn't work, it could be a million other factors that made it not work.
Sure.
So proving a positive is easy. Proving a negative is super hard.
Sure. Now, how far have you gotten into the data collection, and what are your methods of data collection for that particular project? Because it seems like there's a lot of need to understand the market better, especially on the medical side.
Yeah, so that whole project for Aurelius has built an app called Aura, and so that as it grows, that app is kind of being improved. They're adding things like voice recognition and natural language processing to it, and all that to really gather that data. It's been on a fairly small, kind of like, I guess, lack of term, like beta trial from there, but I think it's looking at doing, if it hasn't kind of launched for broader consumption, it's looking at launching for broader consumption here shortly. So the company is Aurelius, like Marcus Aurelius, which I don't have my computer in front of me to spell it. Data.com is the base company on that.
Fantastic. We can put that in the show notes as well. Do you recommend our audience to reach out for any specific reason to Aurelius, or will the information be unveiled as we progress?
No, I think we want people who want to participate and reach out and look in. We really want to start working, with people who, really want to figure out where it's done. And we're really interested in adding people to the group who are willing to provide their kind of experience data with all of this. So if anybody, really wants to kind of, be involved and provide their experience data and be like, sour diesel helps me do whatever, that's awesome. That's the kind of information we want. And then eventually we want to go backwards up with the processors and get their QC data and then run random analysis on their products, and then start doing a lot of the correlation data on the science to then be able to start getting hard data that can be collected, to really demonstrate that this is solving problems for people. It's not, it's not like medicating like alcohol. There's actually other approaches going to this.
Amazing.
I mean, there's enough studies, right? I mean, really, if you look at how many studies there have been on what it can do, there should be more than enough evidence that this has useful use. But the government, they always want more data.
Absolutely. Well,
it's never enough, especially if they don't like it.
Right. Well, also too, pharmaceutical companies, I think a lot of people don't realize that when the drug is launched and marketed, it actually enters the surveillance study mode. So pharmaceutical
Yeah.
companies are always collecting data on the side effect profile of their products, because sometimes you realize that there is something majorly wrong with the product after you launch the product. So that's very good data to collect. So I'm glad you
Well,
guys are
and
working.
you actually have to do it. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I'm just really glad that you guys are working on that project, because I think a lot of
No.
people are really focused on monetization of a specific product, and some people don't really think about this particular aspect of it.
Well, and most people don't realize even in dietary supplements, you're supposed to do a novel dietary ingredient filing and monitor the side effects. So even like if you follow what's probably being proposed for, hemp cannabinoids and probably eventually, THC containing or, drug type cannabis material, it's eventually going to have to go all the same route, because I doubt any of it's going to get, FDA grass. I mean, there's enough concern that they have from the GW studies and all that they, the FDA, I doubt it unless it goes through Congress and they just say make it legal. The FDA is probably going to want huge amounts of data and want this monitored for a long time, because there are, GW Pharma did show some pretty serious contraindications on the product. Now it's super high dosing and you can argue all sorts of things with that. But, at the end of the day, they're going to want more data. And as an industry, we have to provide it to them, because
Sure.
their knee-jerk reaction is to say, no, you can't do this.
Sure.
The knee-jerk reaction is not to let you do it. It's to say no. And so if you want to do this and you want to continue moving this towards the path of legalization and open access for everybody and decriminalization and all that, you're going to have to generate as much of the data. And for God's sakes, legal stuff is not safe, right? We know alcohol at
Sure.
any kind of high level is not safe. We know nicotine has huge problems in smoking. They're
Tylenol
more than
even.
willing to allow products that are not safe on the market for general consumption for certain age groups. They've demonstrated that. It's just a matter we have to get them to a level where, they don't think we're going to run around and like randomly cause crazy stuff with it.
Absolutely. Now, when you were talking about GW, are you talking about Epidiolex and the connection to abnormal liver function tests, or are we talking about something else?
Yeah. I think they demonstrated it was hepatotoxic, and then it has drug interactions with, is it warfarin? I can't remember. It's bad with blood thinners, right? From what I recall. I can't remember off the top of my head right now.
Pretty much.
So and that's the only data they're going off of right now,
Right.
or at least that was my experience when I was at the FDA hearing last year, right? Is the only real data they felt that they got given was really from GW Pharma. I mean, there's so many peer-reviewed papers out there. It gives me a headache to think that that's the kind of the myopic look that they have. But they're the government and they set the rules. So I mean, effectively, unless you change it through Congress and your law, and that approach, you're going to have to follow some of their rules, to really get this accepted federally. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck with this piecemeal state-to-state kind of stuff.
Sure. Now, is the FDA not looking at the other studies because they're not double-blind, or was there another reason given?
I don't know. It's always, when you're dealing with the government, it's really hard to figure out what's going on. Obviously, the United States is in a pretty decent amount of political turmoil right now. So my guess is no one's really paying attention to anything very well, especially this last year. So, I joked as soon as COVID hit, I was like, man, all bets are off, right? They're more worried about getting PPE into the country and various other things. My guess is, hemp kind of rules and scheduling and all that kind of stuff or anything with cannabis is everyone's probably deprioritized that as possibly far down the ladder as they can go.
Sure. Well, you've definitely talked about a lot of innovative strategies and data collection. I'm wondering, have you filed for any IPs, and if so, which ones?
So there's definitely a whole process for filing IP, and a lot of it is definitely kept trade secret, just on the fact that when you're looking at it or doing a logarithms, it's really easy for people to work around your stuff. So it's always this battle of do you file a patent on it, and get a bunch of stuff there. We've identified quite a few pieces of IP just from the data we have gathered on like how certain compounds and mixtures work with each other and whatever. So we're really kind of in an internal debate, do we kind of open source this information for everybody more as a demonstration of what we can find, or do we actually kind of pursue patent protection on these different mixtures and go that way and kind of approach that? I'll be honest, I'm a little more personally leaning towards this kind of this open source stuff because as much as I dislike a lot of stuff like Gary Vaynerchuk says, what I have learned is you can give all your best ideas away and hardly anybody ever executes on them. So the risk of
Right.
something being stolen is pretty little, unless it's something so easy it's easy to steal. And then you
Right.
really couldn't protect it anyways.
Right. Now,
So,
the IP process can be very expensive and time consuming, correct?
yeah, it's super time consuming. A lot of the
Right.
analysis and a lot of all that kind of stuff. It can take, years to figure some stuff
Right.
out. And that's kind of the whole promise and value of a lot of the new kind of self-learning algorithms and some of the machine learning stuff that's out there is you have the ability to kind of throw a bunch of processing power at stuff and speed the whole process up. At least that's the theory.
Right. But in the process of really exploring the patent, you do have to disclose your secret sauce. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, no, yeah, you have to not only do you have to disclose it. If someone finds out you kind of really hid what makes your product work, but you're claiming that's your patent, you can have your patent invalidated and stuff too. So there's all sorts of challenges. I used to always joke is that a patent is only worth as much as you have money to defend it,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because if someone wants in your space and they have way more money than you, they could just bury you in litigation. Where you
Right.
you can't really afford to fight it, right? So I mean, if you go up against Pfizer or Bayer or whatever, if they really want in, unless you have hundreds of millions of dollars in your pocket, that's going to be a really tough fight.
Right. Yeah. Well,
And some people are willing to have that fight, so
yeah, I think whoever is filing
more
for
power
a
to them.
patent would really have to weigh that out, right? It's really not effective unless you can defend it, and that really requires revenue. And if you're a
Yeah,
startup
no.
and pre-revenue, that becomes more and more challenging.
Oh yeah, my first patent stuff. I spent so much money on patents, to like get them and file them because that's what the investors said they wanted. Yada yada yada. And at the end of the day, half the time you change your business plan anyways, right?
Right. You have
So
to
like a
pivot.
patent you file, 5 years ago, thinking that's what you're going to do. You're like, oh, I don't even need any of this now. Like
Right.
it changes so much.
Right. At the same time, I hear in the psychedelic space, patenting is very critical to really bring products into the market. So it seems like there's definitely
Uh,
an interesting consideration there.
yeah, I don't actually know if it is or not. Like that's something I'd have to do a real analysis. I know people are really kind of pushing that that's the case, but I think it's really probably a purified compound in the delivery. I think a lot of people are looking at it from more a pharmaceutical perspective of purifying the compound and doing the delivery side of things.
Right.
You're not going to be able to patent making mushroom tea, right?
Right.
At the end of the day, the old school delivery mechanisms are always going to be there. Now, in the case of some of the legislation, like looking at the Oregon legislation on stuff for their proposed mechanism for psilocybin therapy and whatever, they're probably going to force a whole level of quality or whatever. That probably is going to open up the door for a lot of, patent landscape stuff on like how do you deliver and manufacture it and produce it in a safe way and all that. And so people who do get in and take those patents in place, and if they do have the money because they've raised enough money to kind of protect it and keep small players out, they're probably going to be able to create some monopolies in that space, good, bad,
Right.
or indifferent.
So if you have the money, it could be a good strategic move.
Yeah, no, it could easily be. If you want to ring fence in certain areas, especially around, methods for therapy and all that kind of crazy stuff, my guess is you could make the IP landscape super complicated and painful.
Right. Interesting.
My theory on a lot of patents in the future was always about a freedom to operate. I probably would never try to use a patent as a weapon, but I would try to use a patent to keep someone else like from keeping me out of the space, right? So kind of a lot of like what you see, Tesla does, like Elon Musk, a lot of his patent stuff.
Right.
He's like, oh, anybody can use kind of what I'm doing, right? Kind of opening him up to the world, just because by having those patents, no one can keep him out of that space. And I think that's a much more honorable tactic for a lot of
Sure.
IP, but it's business, so it's worse than war. I always joke business is way worse than war.
Right. Amazing. Well, we definitely
At least
covered
war,
a.
there's rules.
I'm sorry. What is it?
I said at least in war, there's supposed to be rules.
Right. At least we have a Geneva Convention. Romance could be
Yeah.
equally tricky. So I guess romance and business.
Yeah. Minor details.
Minor details, absolutely. So we definitely covered a lot of ground in the cannabis space. I think you touched upon remediation a little bit. Is that a space that you're active in? And if so, what are some of the projects you're working on?
So I've done remediation, like of hazardous materials. That was always my passion. So do you mean like THC remediation or remediation of the soil?
Both, and also I think maybe recycling and repurposing biomass that is not utilized in the beginning stage of the supply chain.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of work kind of in the space of effectively separating or trying to remove undesirable molecules, especially from the cannabis space. So there's a lot of technology out there, to separate THC out. There's a lot of the products you see on the market. People have figured out how to like effectively in the distillate or in the product, turn the THC to CBN or other materials, so then it's quote unquote remediated from there. So there's a whole space there. Yeah, my real passion is like I love like things like phytoremediation and environmental cleanup. No one wants to pay for it, so it's hard to make a living or a business out of it unless you're pretty clever.
Right.
But like, yeah, some of the stuff I've seen with hemp, using hemp strains to do that, it just loves to suck a lot of the, especially heavy metals out of the soil.
Mm-hmm.
We saw things where trace heavy metals of lead or whatever in the soil really accumulated heavily in the plant. From there, so I actually think there's a huge path to being able to clean up soil with using hemp materials. The only problem is now that hemp's toxic. So what do you do with that, right? If you suck all the arsenic or lead or whatever out of the soil and put it in the hemp, now you have hemp and that needs to be treated or whatever from there. And then my partner and I, Taylor, we've done a lot of work on, what do you actually do with the rest of the hemp plant? We've done
Sure.
everything from soaking the flower or the cannabis plant, soaking the flower after it's been extracted to extract the free sugars. We've fermented those sugars into things like lactic acid, which then can be made into PLA polymers for bioplastics. We've done the herd. We've made fuel pellets from it. We've done a ton of R&D on all the pathways. Kind of from a remediation of biomass perspective, we feel the kind of the low-hanging fruit in the industry is really a conversion of all this spent biomass,
Mm-hmm.
into some kind of pellet aggregate for home heating. So living up in Montana or whatever, we have airshed problems, air pollution, all that kind of stuff from like fires and people just burn wood.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a lot of pellet stoves. And so we think there's a whole opportunity, especially kind of in the northern latitudes across the country, to be able to effectively make pellets, hemp pellets they can burn in pellet stoves and go from there. There's an established market, it could be, you could utilize the spent fiber and the spent flour to do that kind of stuff and aggregate it together with a binding agent like a wax, maybe even the wax when you're winterizing, the materials that are produced. So there's a huge opportunity there, we think, for using that biomass. I think the fiber industry, everyone like talks about it and like loves on it for the fiber industry for hemp. I think it's a niche market. Same with bioplastics from hemp. The cost is so much more expensive, even with like the cutting edge technology right now compared to traditional petroleum plastic. That really it's more of like almost like a marketing gimmick. You can make really cool stuff, right? We've done rolling trays, we have displays, we've done scoops, we've done all sorts of crazy stuff with hemp plastic. But really it's more, either someone wants to pay that enhanced cost for the sustainability, or it's more like, oh, this would be really cool at a trade show. I really like trade shows, so I hope they come back because it's where I got to meet a lot of people
Sure.
and kind of like free form and discuss. But yeah, this new kind of, trapped at home, don't meet people world has been really weird for me.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Now, it sounds like a lot of these potential ideas may be expensive, but also they may not necessarily be the best thing for the environment. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what are the paths that we should really put focus and energy into that would truly help the environment?
Yeah, so I think, I've actually radically changed my viewpoint on this. So like, plastic's plastic. So we do a lot of discussion about like, look, plastic's fundamental reason you want to have plastic is so it doesn't fall apart because you want to contain things that normally break stuff down like paper or wax or whatever. And so plastics, like to have the performance we want to do, to have like a water bottle on a shelf for a year or whatever, that's really hard to do with biodegradable materials. So I actually really think the big push needs to be nutrition, right? Factory farming, animal farming, whatever. If we could make kind of, good, low environmental impact agriculture, which my experience with doing hemp seed without fertilizer, without pesticides worked really well. In 2018, I was really pleased with the results from that. If we can make that nutrition, especially protein, like cheaper from a plant-based source and accessible to everybody than it is from like meat or whatever, and go from there, I think we could reduce our environmental impact significantly. And so that's the first place I would focus, is like, how do you just improve everyone's nutrition worldwide? Right? How do we make that more environmentally sustainable? How do we do things with less fertilizer, less pesticides, more bee friendly? I really like a lot of things that bees turn into food for us. So I really don't want them to go away. So I'm really kind of passionate about supporting anything that supports bee diversity, because man, do I really like things like avocados and stuff and lots of fruits. And we need bees for those.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I think nutrition is the big real win. Good protein, good kind of balanced diet, things that just improves people's life in general. And I think with better nutrition, you again go back to reducing people's feeling bad and all of that kind of stuff. And if we could start teaching mechanisms that are just better nutrition, we're going to decrease the reliance on pharmaceuticals. We're going to do a lot of different things. And then if you end up with a healthier, happier population, all this other stuff that we deal with kind of goes away as well, too.
However, it sounds like you can't do that with hemp that you've used to remediate the soil, correct?
That was been my experience, is that stuff ended up right in the plant, ended up in the flower, ended up in the seed. Yeah, well, from a remediation perspective, we didn't do that. There's probably ways to process it and get that stuff out. But then again, that kind of goes towards, do you want a bunch of heavily processed material in your diet or whatever, too? So that's something and if you knew it grew in a field that used to be a hazardous waste field, how comfortable are you going to be eating that material, right?
Absolutely. And it doesn't sound like it would be cost
even
effective.
if you proved it was clean. Yeah. Even if you could prove it was clean, someone's going to be like, well, how do you know for sure? So, I mean, there's always that whole thing of like, that's what we used to always joke about. Everyone talked about toilet to tap, and everyone's like, oh, it's a great idea. We have the technology to recycle that water, and then no one wants to drink toilet water, no matter how clean it is.
Right, yeah. Now,
doesn't matter how much you've proven it, it's great. People don't want to do it.
Now, can the remediation hemp be safely used for hempcrete or to make hemp wood or roads or things like that? Things that are not ingestible.
I think that's a really good, if we can sequester the toxic compounds. So I'll just continue to use heavy metals as an example. So like, I love the idea. I thought about hemp wood years and years ago, because there's a lot of what's called cross-laminated timber up here, which is the same kind of idea, right? It's like advanced like particle board. It's super strong, super whatever. I love the idea of hemp wood. And if you can sequester the heavy metals into that hemp wood, and you'd have to prove they're not going to leach in, and some kid's not going to like lick it and get lead poisoning like the old lead paint chips, right? But if you can prove that, I think like putting it into building materials, road materials, whatever, where it's, those materials are trapped for long periods of time. I love that idea. And it can't be any worse, like if one of those houses caught on fire, than like what's an existing house, right? I just keep looking around my house, looking at like all the electronics and paint and everything. I'm like, oh yeah, this would probably be really bad for the environment if it's burned. So
yeah, when we had the California fires near Santa Rosa, that was a major concern, because everything was burning down and it was just falling right on the wineries. So how much of that, got redistributed through the wine, it remains to be seen. But that was definitely a concern that everyone spoke about.
Yeah, and I think those are all legitimate concerns, because they're just unknowns, right? And humans fear unknown more than anything else. I just I kind of observe that over and over again. Is no information or not knowing is like probably the biggest kind of detriment to human kind of mental stability that I've seen personally with people over and over again. That's why I'm always a big fan of transparency, even if people don't like it, is because if you don't tell me what's going on, my story I'm going to make up in my head is so much better than what's really going on in your life.
That's true. That's very true. Well, you've definitely touched upon a lot of diverse topics within the cannabis space. Given your experience and your insight into the industry, what do you think will be the next blockbuster in terms of ideas and innovation, in terms of, something that, people will talk about? Not another strain, not another edible, but something unique and different and new.
Yeah, I think the real kind of big, amazing thing that's going to be is if people can develop solid, functional, really kind of low dose products that like the average person can use and not like have a negative effect from like memory or like slight intoxication or whatever. I think that kind of low dose segment where it actually is improving your life, like taking a vitamin, right? Like you're more stable or you're more focused or you're more whatever. I think that's kind of the real like near term, short term kind of thing. I think the real blockbuster one is if someone figures out how to make drinking a glass of something like drinking a glass of wine or a beer, and like I can feel an effect in like 15 minutes, but I'm also like clear to work, and like there's something in it that helps it clear out of my system quickly, and like it goes away in a couple hours, just like alcohol. I think that's the real blockbuster. Whoever figures out that real true secret solution and makes a product that works the same for like, let's say 80% of the population, you know, and you get a little giddy, you get a little fun, you kind of relax, but go from there. I think that's what'll dominate the kind of that'll be the person who wins kind of like the 2020s.
Interesting. So do you think we're close enough to that technology for the expedited processing of edibles?
I think quick onset is probably getting there. I think clearing it in a reasonable period of time. Like my guess is if you and I had the same product, you know, I might be stoned for 14 hours and you might only be stoned for 2, right? As an example. Right? And so like being able to clear it quickly and recover quickly from it as well too, that's what's going to make it the difference from being, you know, a casual use material versus something that kind of just like kills your entire evening.
Right. How difficult is it to develop a technology like that for the quick onset?
The quick onset is kind of probably about how quickly you can get it delivered into the bloodstream and bypass mechanisms your body has to clear those compounds. So I think there's technology people can develop to get it in there, right? I mean, smoking is the quick way to do that, right? That's quick onset. So, you know, there's mechanisms we know that are quick onset. I think the harder one is to like figure out how to attenuate or limit the effect on the tail end. Right.
Sure.
And so like any of the side effects on the tail end, like for me, I was never, you know, really not a heavy user of anything just because it affected my memory. Right. I just did not like the fact that like it had an effect on my short-term memory. And I hate that. Right. I like to be able to think. I like to be quick on my feet. Like I want to like figure stuff out. And so that alone is one that would keep me from, you know, using it except possibly like I always joke in work related environments, right? We kind of almost forced to use it. And, you know, and I have a similar effect from full spectrum, hemp extracts, right? If there's too much THC in it, even if it's a legal amount, you know, I'll be slower the next day. Like my, you know, connections don't occur as fast or any of that kind of stuff. So for me, attenuating any of the negative effects is the real win in the space. And that might be a combination of cannabinoids. That might be a combination of other compounds with it. That might be, you know, some of these other variants, right? So you have like THCV or you have THCP or any of these other, maybe it's a modification of the compound that does that. I think if someone could get something where it was acting like alcohol, you know, I go have a beer, you know, have a drink or two with somebody, you know, feel pretty good for an hour or two, and then I can go home and like not ruin everything else. I think that person wins the day.
Is there technology where it helps the product be bypassed by the liver so it doesn't get metabolized by the liver? Does that technology exist yet?
I know there's lots of people working on it and claiming it. I have not, except for some encapsulation and some micelle stuff using some pharmaceutical technologies. I haven't really seen anything that like someone can show me and be like, I did this and it's going to bypass the liver, you know, outside of smoking it, obviously. Inhalation delivery does bypass that because it hits your brain first, right? Based on where the blood flows from the lungs.
So that could be.
Yeah, anything consumed or like drinking, yeah, it all hits your liver first. So figuring out how to bypass that mechanism, you know, safely and effectively and not have it last forever in your system. Lots of the times bypass technologies also make it last longer in your system. So there's always that risk too. If you bypass those systems, how do you encourage your body to clear it out in a proper period of time?
Right. Now, obviously cannabinoids.
Pharmacokinetics, right? It's such a fun field.
That's right. Yes. So I know there is definitely some companies that are taking cannabinoids and making them water soluble. Is there any physiological benefit to having a water soluble product? Aside from adding it to beverages.
I think from a consumer perspective, I think that kind of water solubility. I think water solubility is probably the wrong term, and it angers lots of like hardcore true scientists. Pretty much, there's three primary technologies, right? So the first technology you can use to make cannabinoids water soluble is you literally just mix it with an emulsifier or like a detergent. Like literally you mix it with soap, right? And so that's the vast majority of products on the market. So anything that quote unquote says nano or whatever, most likely what they've done is they've mixed it with some kind of emulsifying agent that kind of lets it, suspend in water, and they get it small enough so it stays suspended in water. From there, the next kind of technology after that people can do, and one that I think is superior, but I think it's because I'm jaded by the food industry, so I really like it, is there's encapsulation technology, right? So you can literally put a molecule of the cannabinoid inside of like the equivalent of like a sugar shell. Or something like that. So you really kind of surround it with something, and then that shell is water soluble or water dispersible, based either on particle size or chemical effect. I'll stop for 1 second.
I'm so sorry. I've never had
No.
such a large number of people come into this house. This is bad timing.
No,
I
don't be
apologize.
sorry.
Yeah.
So then the second technology is the encapsulation technology, and that's the one I favor. But I see it deployed very well in the food industry for very sensitive flavors. Making water soluble, oil soluble flavors water soluble, extracts, all that kind of stuff. So I like that one. And then the third one I've seen people deploy is literally a chemical modification of the molecule, right? So people are doing things.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Oh yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry.
Okay.
And then, the secondary technology or the third technology is really where people are chemically modifying the cannabinoid, be that CBD or THC, and they're sticking they're chemically binding like a sugar molecule to it or another thing that actually makes that compound soluble. And so those ones are fascinating technologies, but we're having enough trouble getting cannabinoids accepted as, in the food supply or in product supply anyways. So now you're creating a brand new chemical by adding sugar to it or another compound to it. Then how are you going to get that approved by the FDA? That's going to need a bunch of safety studies and whatever on it. So chemically modifying a cannabinoid, while it's fascinating, it seems super cool and all that, I think the regulatory hurdles with it are pretty tough to deal with. So that would not be one I would suggest a company pursue unless they have a ton of money and want to do all the safety studies.
Right. And that is different from encapsulation?
Yeah. So that's different from encapsulation, because encapsulation you keep the molecule as is, right? So you keep CBD or THC as kind of a standard molecule, and then you surround it in another molecule, right? And so you'll hear technology like liposomes, which is kind of a combination between emulsification and encapsulation, because you're creating these structures around it. Traditional encapsulation usually uses like a sugar shell around it.
Got it. And what about, I know a lot of companies talk about nanotechnology. What does that mean? And I do believe some of them are using the term incorrectly. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would say the vast majority of companies I've interacted with are using the term nanotechnology incorrectly. So all nanotechnology actually means is you're smaller than like 1 micron. You go into the nanometer size range, right? So you make a molecule that's smaller than that. In theory, if you have cannabinoids and ethanol and they're dispersed evenly, it's literally they're one molecule floating around individually. That molecule's well into the nano range, right? Most people what they're calling nano is it's just an emulsion, and then they run it with some kind of mixer or sonicator or high shear emulsifier or whatever to get the little blobs or little spheres or whatever you want to call it, right? Like the little soap dots in there, the best way to describe it in my brain, below that size. Now the problem is there's actually a lot of stuff that you have to do if you're truly nanotechnology. So like in the food industry, nanotechnology is kind of a big no-no because people are afraid of it, and you have to prove it's safe. So all these people labeling their products nano are theoretically supposed to go through rigorous safety studies to prove that their nanotechnology is safe, because some nanomaterials perform radically different than the larger molecules. So a great example is like asbestos fibers. Little nanofibers of asbestos literally poke through cells and cause cancer, right? So like there's concerns about specific nanomaterials because they do behave so differently from a larger molecule.
That is very interesting. I would have never assumed that.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of that is people don't understand that, like, in the EU and the US, you're supposed to prove a nanomaterial safe, which has its own level of rigorous and safety studies and stuff you're supposed to do. So, I mean, I would not label any of my products nano, but it sounds super sciencey. So people love to say it.
Absolutely. Is there a legitimate cannabinoid company that does have a nano product? that they are marketing?
I haven't seen one that is not like an emulsion, and like I didn't do particle size analysis, so I didn't know if their emulsion was actually producing, nano size material or not. All the stuff that we designed, we intentionally kept above 1 micron on purpose, because we didn't actually we wanted to follow food industry rules and not break into that nanometer range because we didn't want to have to trigger like that whole new level of compliance on stuff.
How fascinating. But it does sound like if you're able to get it below 1 micron, it might be better absorbed. Would that make logical sense?
Yeah, that's the theory. Is a lot of the nanomaterials will be better absorbed or go right into your system or all of that. I have noticed a large difference, especially with like hemp products, between water soluble ingredients, whether that's encapsulated or emulsified or not water soluble ingredients. I've noticed a major difference versus like taking like an oil tincture. The onset's much quicker, lower doses you seem to feel it. So I think there's some amount of it actually bypassing your liver and not going through the digestion pathway. But no one's really done any of the blood studies or uptake studies or whatever. I mean, maybe some people have done it out there, but they're not openly sharing their work that I found. I haven't looked recently, but everyone talks about getting like blood draw studies done and like doing timing where someone eats a product and then they measure the amount of material in their bloodstream, right? A lot of that work should be done with this material.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for breaking down so much of the technology that goes into making edibles in the cannabis industry. I want to make sure I address any wish list that you might have. Is there anything that you'd like to address our audience with?
I always like to do, especially if the audience, likes to use these products or whatever. I'm always like any feedback, for the industry, for the, for this podcast, for whatever, anything that you like think should be done. That's the feedback the industry needs, right? You're like, yeah, everything's this, and I really don't like it because of X, Y, and Z. That's as important information as much as I like vanilla flavor, right?
Sure.
So any feedback, like on the consumer side of things, like the tech's the tech, right? The plant produces the compounds. Extracts can only do so many things. Like there's certain limitations that just exist out there. But as we get to the consumer form factor, there's so much that can occur, right? Like, do you want to have it be an edible? Would you prefer a beverage? Do you really like smoking product? Like, those are all things that we need to know because, like, then, like, maybe there's new pathways we could develop to make vapes safer, right? Or make inhalation systems safer, right? Where it's not, you're not heating material up and, like, breathing in, combusted material and all that. Maybe there's ways to do these deliveries. Pharmaceuticals have form factors for inhalation, stuff like that. So as we look at what people want to do, like, how do we develop a product that makes the consumer happy, right? And, there's multiple people that said this. I heard this from the CPG company. There's guys that I follow on LinkedIn that always say this, but at the end of the day, all of the brands, our only real job is to delight the customer. So if we can delight the customer and they love what's being made, everyone's going to be happy. The customer's happy because they get a product they want, and the manufacturer's happy because they're selling something.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure we put all of the contact information you like for your company in the links as well. This has been a fascinating conversation. I know we got really into the weeds with some of the concepts, but again, thank you for breaking them down and sharing your insights with us.
Well, thank you very much. This was an excellent conversation. I love these kind of things.
Thank you so much. Well, have a great day, and I hope to chat soon then.
Yeah, talk to you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.